Thanks for coming, everybody. Well, this is the last photo VA lecture of the semester, which is kind of crazy that the semester is already at this point, and Thanksgiving's next week. But so I'm gonna do a little introduction and then hand it over, and then I'll stop talking and we can get into the good stuff. So the world is constantly more interesting than any mind, any imagination. Here comes that statement, the world's stranger than fiction. But within this way of thinking about art making, here arises the paradox. It takes a specific person's mind filled with subjectivity and an awareness to understand, to question, to react to this forever interesting world, and to validate and create from their existence and add a sparkle into the dark of the shared now. So how does someone fencing in a gym become so monumentally heavy, but so light, all in a singular gesture, so perverse? How do the ridges in this mountain become extraterrestrial when we know the water? We are torn between realities, but maybe torn is too violent for the care that is felt in really looking. We are dancing between realities in the eyes, the skin, the trees, the clouds, and the ink, and God damn, I want to dance right now. Through this specific mind, the sparkle, a new world is constructed, and this new world feels familiar. However, something more felt than known. This tilted familiarity we are confronted with as viewers is informed by a past, histories traveling through time and light, collapsing into fragments, into poems as spirit guides lend a hand to push us forward, but not define our future. This specific past, the past for the reason I'm writing this, is brought into light from an origin in the post-Soviet Baltic country Estonia in 1984, followed by the migration to the United States in 2002 to dive into this absurd, beautiful, delusional obsession with expression that is art making. There's a soft mythical presence to Terttu's photographs I felt when I first stumbled upon them on the screen after seeing a photograph of a sensual installation at Soloway pop up in my feed. From that, an aura formed in my head around the artist and the work, and I was so happy sitting in that space exploding with associations and disparate narratives that made sense within myself. But as curiosity kept moving forward, and you have to write a visiting artist lecture, introduction, biography, you have to look into the specifics. So Terttu Uibopuu is a photographer, bookmaker, and educator currently living in New York City. She was born in 1984 in Estonia and moved to the States in 2002. Terttu received her BFA from Columbia College Chicago and her MFA in photography from Yale University in 2011, where she was also awarded the Alice Kimball Traveling Fellowship and the Tierney Fellowship. Since leaving Yale, she has taught at the International Center of Photography, Wesleyan University, and the Borough of Manhattan Community College. In 2012, she participated in the AIM program at the Bronx Museum of Arts, and in 2017, she was a workspace resident at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. Her work has been shown nationally and internationally at the Bronx Museum of Arts in New York, Nicole Klagsbrunn in New York, Schneider Gallery Chicago, Co-Prosperity Sphere Chicago, and the Society of Korean Photography in Seoul, Korea, among others. In 2017, she had a solo exhibition titled Caught in a Loop Gesture at Soloway Gallery in New York, and in 2018, had a solo exhibition at University Galleries of Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. The city is called Normal. This exhibition featured 25 photographs taken throughout the United States and Estonia, drawn from her project ESE, East Southeast, and was accompanied by a handmade artist book. Okay, hopefully I didn't miss too much, and I'm going to finally stop talking, and I'm so excited to welcome and hand the mic over to Terttu.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm gonna just take a second to set up the screen share. So one moment, bear with me. So I'm very excited to be here, and it's really a great honor to be invited. I'm calling you from my studio in Brooklyn. And I hope you all are staying safe and your families and friends are well during these times. I also wanted to say how much I enjoyed the pop-up lecture series this past spring. It was great to see people like, Ben Stiller and Carol Walker be asked the same set of questions. And for me, it was a real treat. And it was really good to hear when Hilton all said, how these times will not be defined by what the politicians say, but what artists make. So I will start by giving you a little backstory and show you some early photographs I have taken without getting too much into my biography, but I think it's important to my work and to understanding it. I was born in Estonia and grew up in the capital, Tallinn, and I moved to the States at age 17 in 2002. Um, just so you know, in 1991, I was 7 years old when Soviet Union fell apart, just a few weeks away from starting first grade. Estonia was on the brink of going to a war in that August of 1991, but the situation diffused and eventually the tanks left our country as well. And actually my mom just the other day, she told me that she thinks that growing up in Soviet Union was like living during a pandemic, but it was, you know, a 45-year-long pandemic. Living with all the restrictions and not being able to travel really reminded her of that time. You know, also the political absurdity must have felt very familiar. And you know that the only news one could trust was the weather forecast. That used to be the joke. So growing up in the 90s really did look like Boris Mikhailov's case history. Keep in mind that after the fall of Soviet Union, many newly independent countries experienced the world of kind of experienced this period of the wild west. We didn't really have IRS in the beginning of the 90s, so you can imagine what that does to people tasting freedom for the first time. At the same time, it was also the first time we started to have a homeless population. So at age 9, my parents divorced, and I blame the rise of capitalism for that. So I went to live with my grandmother in this town pictured here, Hademeste. It really is a village because the population is about 700, and I lived here until age 15 with my grandmother. And my grandmother came from a well-educated family, but her entire family was deported to a Gulag work camp in Siberia in 1941 because they were teachers and ran a small country school. My grandmother and her brother, they were really the only ones that survived and lived Siberia as orphans for 6 years. And she returned to Estonia at age 10. And she was really like a mother to me. And this is the story for most Estonian families. This is, the story of my family is not unique. Over 20,000 people were deported in 1941 in Estonia. And, our population is very small. It's just 1.4 million right now. When I moved back to Tallinn, I started taking photographs as a teenager, and my first camera was given to me by my grandfather, pictured here. He was an artist himself, and the only one in my family with an untraditional career. He was a firefighter, a radio reporter, Estonian champion of skeet shooting, a designer of various machines and furniture. And later in life, he worked for the military. And I think he would have really loved the poster Nick and Ian made for this lecture today, because he was also a graphic designer at one point, making communist propaganda posters. So when I was 16, my mom had found a boyfriend online who lived in the United States, and she moved here for 1 year. I often referred to her as a mail order bride. So from 16 to 17, I lived by myself in Tallinn. I went to a lot of raves and did really badly in school. At that time, I also saw the movie Kids. And me and my friends, we were super obsessed with this HBO prison show Oz. I wasn't tough or anything, but these things just blew my mind at the time and really opened my periphery and deepened my curiosity about the States. And so my mom came back from the US after 1 year hiatus, And by that time, I had won a photography contest by the cigarette company, Philip Morris. I learned this later, but this was a very typical scheme of Western companies who wanted to invest in new markets, particularly those in the Eastern Bloc countries, to buy art and sneak in, through the market that way. So my prize was a trip for two to St. Petersburg, Russia, but I decided to drop out of high school in my junior year, and I exchanged that trip for a one-way plane ticket to Chicago to go live with a family of my mom's American boyfriend. My mom stayed behind in Estonia because of not being able to renew her visa, but I was able to come on a tourist visa, and I overstayed it. In 2002, I arrived to Cary, Illinois, by myself, a small town in northwest suburbs of Chicago. The American suburbs was a bizarre landscape to land in, coming from a medieval city, Tallinn. But I didn't care. I was so happy to be in America and get away from everything. Larry Clark Tulsa was my first photo book that I bought in the US. I was living with my mom's then ex-boyfriend's mother. I got a GED, eventually got a student visa, went to community college for 2 years, and then transferred to Columbia College of Chicago. During my community college studies in 2003, I met Anna Steinschleiger, who was the first person to tell me about Yale photo program. She had just given birth to her second daughter and was teaching photography in my community college. She wasn't a professor of mine, but we took a liking to each other. She had been to Estonia many times as a child, staying in a popular summer vacation city, Pärnu, not far from where I lived with my grandmother. I was very drawn to her and loved her sort of like a no nonsense way of being, even though she was a deeply religious person then in 2003, being a Jewish Orthodox faith. But she still would make fun of me all the time, being an Estonian, and for making fun of how slowly we speak and react as a nation, and how ugly the men are in Estonia. And I just loved her. She was refreshing compared to the usual sort of niceness of the Midwesterners. So here's a photo of the sexiest man alive in Estonia in 2006. He's a famous actor, Taavi Eelma. I read the news one day about the selection in a newspaper, so I Googled for his email and contacted him saying I want to photograph the sexiest man alive, and he agreed to model for me, and this probably was like one of the first photos I took of a stranger. And so at Columbia College, my biggest mentor was Paul D'Amato. I got very interested in documentary photography and had an opportunity to drive to a small town in Kentucky in 2008. I really loved the people and the landscape there, and gained a lot of courage to photograph strangers. I remember I felt really, kind of invincible as a photographer for the first time. I wasn't afraid to go up to anyone, and I felt it was my, kind of like my special power to be a foreigner. I really used it for my advantage, and I also was able to kind of live out this dream to be a photographer, making work on the road. But my big project, my first big project was a series about suburban women. I made a handmade book of that as well, which I'm actually going to show you. you know, I got really into bookbinding when I lived in Chicago and just really learned how to make handmade books. I had, you know, a few very close friends who were bookbinders and book conservators, so they kind of took me under their wing and taught me. But this project is about, you know, women who are living in the suburbs, and I was sort of interested in the same environment where I had landed in, and I wanted to kind of photograph the women either being very content with where they are or pushing against it. You know, most of my life I've actually been a waitress, and so I knew a lot of women, and I started really, you know, photographing women I knew. And so I don't know if you can see from the small screen, but I have, here's, you know, a book that I made. Like, maybe, should I stop sharing my screen maybe, or maybe you can see it a little bit. But it's a handmade book, and maybe I'll just lower my screen. I hope it's not too tiny, but you'll get an idea. I'll just show you a few pages. And I learned, you know, when I was in Chicago, I realized, like, you can, you know, print your own pages, and you can use you know, you can use the binding techniques that I learned in the Book and Paper Center. And so I made this book that is actually, you know, it's quite special because it's a quarter leather bound book. And when you look at the spine, it's kind of curved, it's kind of rounded. It took, you know, it's obviously called a French bound because it's rounded. It's not a flat back that most books are. And I just really kind of loved that I can, you know, print out the pages myself on a 3880, and that's kind of what I do right now anyway. And, you know, made this book. I also have in this series, it's mostly consists of portraits, but I also have some landscapes in it. I will show you. I think the same landscape you just saw, that are full bleeds. And, you know, I can talk about books for a while. And I also got, you know, I got into making boxes for the books. It has like a really nice little slip case for it as well. So it kind of fits right in it. And that was actually, I believe I showed this book when I, you know, applied to Yale as well. So when I applied to Yale, it was really because of Paul D'Amato kind of pushing me to do that. And, you know, I needed to go to grad school because my visa was ending. And so, you know, obviously ecstatic to get in. But when I got in, I started photographing couples after showing this picture, probably my first critique. Which I took in Florida, where I had to go to a funeral of my mom's ex-boyfriend during the first month of school. And I was sharing a hotel room with this couple who was really, you know, they were trying to have a threesome with me. So instead, you know, doing that, I asked if I could photograph them. And I heard Paul Graham talk about this idea of, you know, this idea of a key image, which kind of unlocks the project or is an entrance point to a project. So this definitely was kind of my key image to the work that I did after this. So I continued photographing couples, and I think even at some point, maybe it probably was John Pilston who called my work sacred and profane. And I was like, yes, this makes sense to me. And I'm sure he has said it to, you know, other students as well, but I really needed to hear that at the time. You know, this sort of term sacred and profane kind of resonated with me. It was almost like, I also remember Katie Grannon, she kept telling me to let out my inner freak during a one-on-one meeting. And, you know, I think I was just kind of ready to hear these things when I was at school. I also ended up going my second year, I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this was kind of my pilgrimage to Larry Clark's Tulsa. And also it was surprise birthday present for my good friend Sarah from her boyfriend to kind of unite us because Sarah was living in Tulsa and we hadn't seen each other for a while. And, you know, Sarah and I, we used to make collaborative work together. And so when I got to Tulsa, we were just kind of on fire. We approached a lot of men together to photograph them nude, and it was really exhilarating to kind of make work together in some way, just to cast people. And this is Sarah, actually. And it also, at this time, it became really clear to me that, you know, especially I was obsessed with Lee Friedlander's nudes. You know, it's kind of like the photo book, or like the photo ABC to me. And I think I really realized that, you know, this idea that it's not enough to just like have an exotic subject to photograph, but I, as a photographer, I also have to make an exotic looking photograph. And I think that really sort of sunk in. And I also made a video of my friend Sarah in Tulsa, which was kind of a love letter to her. But it really caused us almost to end our friendship. So I don't show it anymore, but I'm willing, you know, the movie or the film is about, you know, her kind of acting out different characters and me filming her in this very voyeuristic way. I think earlier today I mentioned this to Alex, like the Beaver trilogy was sort of like an inspiration to me, that film, for making a film of Sarah. And the video also shows, you know, Sarah and I, we photographed her ex-boyfriend nude, and so there was a lot of, you know, different kind of acts in it. But thanks to her, I really started to, you know, search and be interested in people who wanted to kind of like exhibit themselves, who wanted to be in front of the camera. So it wasn't so much of me trying to talk somebody into being photographed, but actually find people who were sort of exhibitionists. So once, you know, the summer between first and second year, I went to Kentucky, back to Kentucky, the same area, to photograph 4th of July parades. And I met Timmy, who had just gotten out of a juvenile center. And, you know, he was kind of hitting on me, and I just really wanted to make pictures. And I just asked him sort of like, okay, like, so let's, you know, photograph you nude. And I told him that I'll probably show these photographs in public. And he was like, yes, please put these pictures everywhere. I want to become a porn star. So again, it was sort of like, you know, this I wouldn't say, you know, luck, because I'm sure I kind of attract a certain kind of people as well. But, you know, it was kind of great to work with a person who's so willing and eager to be in front of the camera. And, you know, Tina, this is a picture of Tina. I also met her in a similar manner. I was, you know, driving somewhere outside of New Haven, and, you know, saw her walking on the side of the highway, and I just stopped and I said, like, hi, like, I need to ask you something strange. And she was like, I love strange questions. And then I told her I wanted to make a picture of her, and she was like, yeah, like, of course, do you want to photograph me with my snake? And I just, you know, really, like, again, I loved how, you know, world just sometimes gives you back so much more than what you bargained for when you're kind of curious and open. And, you know, ever since being a kid, I love talking to strangers or meet people on the streets. And so Yale, you know, Yale happened, and it was, you know, this really incredible time. And I think even though I spent most of it with a really kind of, I don't know, a strong imposter syndrome probably. And I wish I was more confident then, but, you know, I felt very supported, you know, by Todd and Chip and everyone, and had made a big change in my work that I think otherwise couldn't have happened in such a short amount of time. And, you know, I'm sure you already know this. Another great perk at Yale is free therapy. So there's always that. And so I think all of us, we were in therapy at some point. But after Yale, I moved to New York, and you know, I was kind of ill prepared, to be honest. I think I really should have listened to Chris Killip when he said that, you know, don't move to the big city as a photographer, move to a small place, and because that's the only way you could continue making work and not spend all your energy like surviving in a big city. But you know, I'll make it kind of short, but I did start, you know, dating someone from the program, and we got married, and I moved in with his mom while he was still in the program. So I don't recommend that. And I had, you know, a hard time finding a job in New York. I had really no connections, and I finally was able to get one class at ICP. And it was a bookbinding class that I had designed and proposed. So I was kind of teaching photographers how to, you know, make a layout of your book in InDesign or Photoshop, and then print it yourself and like stitch it together, bind it together. But I really was like a country pumpkin in New York, and I wish I really prepared myself better. But in 2014, I was going through a divorce and wanted to really kind of focus on my career. I was able to get a studio and, you know, felt more comfortable living in New York. And I had this strong urge to photograph something, you know, other than people. I wanted to really cast like a wider net. You know, I was still really drawn to the South, and I decided to go to Louisiana and stayed in New Orleans. But I really, you know, I wasn't really interested in New Orleans as a city, so I mostly photographed outside of the city. I met this like ex-cop there who drove me around and showed me different areas in the bayou. And I remember at some point I was like on a boat with him, just him and I, in the middle of a swamp. And I was just like, kind of dawned on me that, you know, maybe I should be more careful or a little bit less naive. But you know, I have been lucky with good people when out photographing. You know, and I also, when I, you know, kind of started thinking about, you know, this wasn't really a project at this point, the East Southeast, and I wasn't, you know, true to the geography all the time, because some of the pictures, and I'll show you this book too, you know, they're not all taken in the South. They're like, a lot of them are taken in New York City and in the Bronx. Like this photograph too, like I used to, you know, volunteer or teach in this senior center in the Bronx. And so I photographed there. And so some of the pictures in the book that are really, you know, are about the South and Estonia are, you know, they've been taken in other places as well. But I'll tell you a bit more about that. And here's a photo of this guy Tyler, and he was showing off this kind of like a biblical tattoo that he had gotten. You know, and even though I was kind of gung-ho about making landscape photographs, I just really, I couldn't escape making portraits and being, you know, a magnet for a certain kind of person or subject. I think I can't run away from that. You know, and so that same year when I started pictures in, you know, photographing in Louisiana, I also would keep going back to Estonia, and you know, I tried to look at Estonia, you know, through the lens of kind of this like resilience and grit of my homeland. I really wanted to show that in some way, and I think that was because I was really, you know, I got really interested in trauma and trauma recovery. I read this book, The Body Keeps the Score, and I was just really really inspired to somehow like visualize what would trauma recovery like look like in a photograph. So I spent like a whole summer in Estonia going to this one boxing club and photographing mostly Russian boxers. And, you know, at the time I thought I had two separate projects. When I would come back in my studio, I had like two separate walls, one for Louisiana and one for Estonia. And when I was in Estonia, I also wanted to, I liked kind of also highlighting the stereotypes of, you know, Eastern Europe with the harsh flash, but I also wanted to create pictures that, you know, showed some kind of an intimacy or looked almost like a personal diary, photographing the notion of home and homeland, and its people recuperating from its past. And you know, I've never had this, you know, displacement issue, like that I don't belong or anything. Like I feel very much American, but I also feel very much Estonian. And I just really wanted to make a project about both countries and have this sort of impossible task of bridging a very capitalistic country to a new and inspiring capitalistic country. So I sort of like, that was kind of in the back of my mind when I started to work on it, but I still really hadn't made the connection yet. So this is a scene that is very familiar to me from my childhood. These two men sleeping during daytime. You know, they were just opposite sides of each other at the same location. You know, Estonia has a really big alcoholism and suicide problem. And, you know, it's not a surprise. We have like 9 months of winter and very little daylight. And, you know, here's a photo I took when I visited like a family friend and their son, who was 14 years old at the time. This is like, you know, a 14-year-old boy's bedroom. But I like that whenever I show this picture, everybody just thinks or assumes this is, you know, a picture that I made in the States, in the US. I also was really interested in like photographing inanimate objects, and the whole series just has a lot of like rocks in it, or kind of like a rock theme that runs through it. And here you see, this is like, it's kind of hard to see on a small slide, but it's actually a female fencer. And when you look, you know, when you look at it closely, you see her pink nail polish and jewelry on her fingers. And I just kind of love her stance and fight against this like invisible enemy. You know, it's quite difficult to photograph in Estonia in this transparent way, because you know, people have been so aware of each other, and we, you know, we were raised to always be very suspicious of one another, and, you know, always read between the lines. And so it's, you know, these pictures were kind of difficult to make, actually, because you can't really be candid about it. And here is this is like a flooded prison, and it's used as a beach in the summertime. You know, when you first, maybe when you look at it, it looks kind of like this blue lagoon, and it seems really seductive. But then you probably notice the ruins and almost kind of the fakeness of it. It's closed to the public now, but on this particular day when I took the photo, there was a group of men on the beach that were US soldiers, because there's a US Army base not far from this location. And so I love how small and unnoticeable the US soldiers are here. And you know, to me, I was kind of, maybe this is a stretch, but I was thinking about it kind of symbolized, you know, coming to terms with this, I don't know, avoidant nature of the Western world, and, you know, thinking about, you know, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939 between Stalin and Ribbentrop, and because, you know, because of that, you know, that kind of started the Soviet Union, which was sort of like, you know, it was a death sentence to Estonia, really. And, you know, which majority of the world really ignored until the 1980s. So it was kind of, you know, it was, for me, that's what that picture meant, even though, you know, the soldiers on the beach are quite small. And so I've always been drawn to people still basking in sunshine, even though they're in this place that is really scarred or damaged in some way. That's always been really interesting to me. So as I said, I still kept the work separate for a while, but I showed these pictures to Paul Graham at some point, and he really encouraged me to mix them. I mean, it's very typical of Paul, probably. But then we talked about it, and I really started seeing the connection when it was really obvious that I had photographed the same thing in both countries. I think at some point he pulled out a picture of like a white car in Louisiana in the bayou, and then like a white car in Estonia in the wintertime, and just like kind of showed me, like pulled out the evidence and was like, you are looking at the same things in both places. You are the same person, so there is a connection. And I think the only way this could work, because on the wall it just felt really unnatural and kind of contrived, was to make a book. And so I used so the book, I have it right here. I'm just going to take off the cover. It looks like this. Here's the cover. And I used this design that was made by the designer of this book is a friend of mine, Aurora Robles. So Aurora also went to Yale, and her and I, we worked on this. We had made a zine together. So she designed this zine of my photographs, and I really loved the design. And I was like, I want to use this for the book. And I hope you guys can see it. I'll just show you how it's kind of the design of it. So what she did was she added these inserts, these leaves that were smaller size than the bigger leaves. So when you look at, sometimes you look at a photograph of Estonia, and there's a smaller picture in it that, whether it's from Estonia or not, it doesn't matter. But it was a way to kind of like nest pictures inside of each other. And when you close the small leaf, you will see the big picture again. So I kind of love that, she made this design where you're forced to see the photograph twice, 2 times. I hope this is kind of visible, and you'll see over here, there are these more kind of obvious picture, but like, for instance, like this image, when you open, you don't see it from the screen, but there's like a small little leaf over here, and you'll have this discovery, or a picture like this, and there's an insert. I'll try to open this over here, and there's another photo, and you close it. And so I just thought, this was really, it fit perfectly for what I wanted to do and what I was trying to do. Even though this is kind of a nightmare to mass produce, so I've been making these books, just like handmade. And it's also like, people like to say that, oh, it has like an exposed spine to it, but it's not exposed spine. It's actually just this is called a text block. So it's just a book without a cover. It doesn't have a casing. Usually you would have a case, but this is just a plain text block that's sewn together. And what I'm also really excited about is there's a really great essay that was written by this Soviet art historian in Estonia. And so she, Liisa Kaljula, she's a curator and art historian, and she wrote, a really great essay that, kind of put me or situated me in the context of other Soviet artists. And in this perfect way, the essay starts out with a Rihanna song. It's like, we found love in a hopeless place. So I just, really, really love that. It's very fitting. And yeah, I was able to make these books. I did the LMCC residency in 2017, and so I just kind of cranked out a lot of these books. And if you're curious and you want to make a book, you can always ask me afterwards. But I like the Moab papers. The Moab papers, the double-sided papers, are really great because the grain runs short ways, and so you can fold the pages the right way. And yeah, I think it's worked out really well. So yeah, if you have any kind of like book questions afterwards too, I'll be happy to share what I know. And so first time I showed this project titled ESC, East Southeast. It is actually a cardinal direction, and I like it's just like a direction, it seems like you're going back and forth, or it's like a round trip somewhere. And the show, what Ian mentioned, was in Soloway Gallery. It was sort of like a smaller selection of the final work, 12 photographs. But I loved working, with a small space, and I was able to kind of experiment with different ways of displaying the work as well, which I was only able to do it because of the space and how it's laid out. But then in 2018, I worked with the curator, Jason Judd, who invited me to do a solo show of, about like 25 photographs, and then also the book at the university galleries in Illinois. And the same exhibition, it traveled to Rockford Art Museum in 2018 as well. So it was, kind of a great ending to the project, because sometimes it's hard to know when to finish the project, and so the book and the show definitely were that. And so I do have some new work to show you, which is mostly right now, it's not sort of like a final, there's no final project yet, but it's of landscapes and of women. And again, I sort of keep them separate right now to make sense of it all. And I think maybe right now this this term of like, motherland and Mother Earth, it's still sort of stuck with me, and I keep thinking about it. And I always come to my projects from a very kind of obvious place, or think about them even in this kind of a corny way, just to have some clarity at first. And so this photograph is taken in Israel. It's taken in a kibbutz by the Dead Sea. My partner is Israeli, so now I have a really great excuse to investigate a different landscape. It's not super important where the pictures are taken, but I really love this region by the Jordan River, and so that's something that I'm hoping to go back to and make more pictures by the Jordan River area. And I just love photographing in Israel too. It's a big task, but it's liberating, since I don't really have a connection to the country, and it's been really interesting to like explore it as a foreigner. And so right after the museum show, I also became a mom, and here's my son Marcel. On first year of motherhood, it's kind of hysterical, to be honest. I really, I felt kind of like Gina Rowlands in A Woman Under the Influence. I really went through that whole movie, I think, in 1 year, to be honest. And I think I told everyone not to do it, don't do it, and probably had to listen to a lot of Esther Perel podcasts to get me through the first year. But I also ran into I remember I ran into Anna. Of course, somehow she keeps coming back. I ran into Anna and I told her, I was like, I feel so crazy. And she was like, she said, after she had a child, she thought, like, what the hell did I do? She was sort of had the same feeling. So, but, it gets better after the first year. And now the pictures are coming together as well. And, it's really good to be back in a studio. And so I'm also right now I'm teaching full-time as a photography professor at Borough of Manhattan Community College. And I feel really lucky as a community college alumna myself to be able to live in New York and teach and make work. And I do think I'm returning to photographing women again, probably from a different sort of gaze and perspective. So I sort of made like a full circle in some way. And I remember this also probably sounds a little corny, but I remember John Pilson. You always said, we only probably have one story to tell, right? And so it's maybe this is my story, and maybe this is I kind of keep going back to this like the womanness or motherhood, and I will see where this will take me. But thank you very much. I'm ready for questions if you have questions. And yeah, I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much for a great talk. It was so great to see all those pictures. Very exciting and so impressive.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg.
So maybe I could start off by asking, you have a very kind of interesting relationship to books, I think more so than other artists. And I'm curious how you think about your pictures in terms of how they exist in exhibitions or on walls as opposed to in book form. And what do you feel for you is the most ideal presentation of your work? And tell us more about your involvement in books and book making.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my ideal sort of vehicle is definitely the book. I have a hard time with exhibition. Also, in a book, you can show, you control how people look at it, and you have a certain kind of sequence, and it's also more enjoyable. Like I feel like with an exhibition, for me it's just becomes so much about the space and working with space, and I don't work with an installations or sculpturally, so it's more difficult. I mean, I do love seeing a printed photograph on a wall, like I love that, but I think it always, like all the I always think about the book when sort of the work has finally gotten to a place that I'm like kind of moving and grooving. So once I'm like, I know what the project is and I can keep going back to a certain area and make work. It's sort of the book always is the focus. Like that's sort of like the end goal. And yeah, I've made a lot of books, and I also like that books don't have to be so final. Like I also like, I've had so many different versions of this book, and like playing with these, what are the pictures that should be sort of like have this surprise or coming in here. And I also at first I tried to really sort of make it line up perfectly everywhere. Like it was kind of a total nightmare to have it line up perfectly. And then at some point I was like, I think it was also probably Paul who said, like, he was telling me about the story about Richard Billingham's Raise a Laugh. And apparently there was like a big printing mistake that happened there with the first edition or something. And maybe it was the pictures of the birds that weren't supposed to be full bleeds or something like that. And they ended up leaving the mistake in. And so he really encouraged me, like, you know, if you have, when it doesn't line up perfectly, or when there's another photo that peeks through or something, like don't try to, you know, be so perfect with it or so precious with it. So I also, like, with the later kind of editions or versions I made of this book, I left a lot of mistakes in, and I kind of like that. And so I think it wouldn't have happened if I just made one book and the book. So yeah.
So we see you in your studio, which makes me just want to also ask about your post-production process and sort of the work that's done after you make the pictures, and editing process, printing process, all of that.
Yeah, you know, I don't really photograph in my studio, so it's all for, you know, I have a printer here, and I use my studio, you know, just to lay out the work and make a lot of work prints. And also now, you know, because of having a child, like, it's a place to really think, you know. I didn't really know how much I will miss actually thinking, like having a place to go and, like, sort of reflect. And so so yeah, it's definitely it's kind of a straightforward studio practice where I just come in and edit, and I make a ton of work prints. And then if the large scale prints, I go out and I make the large scale prints. But the small work prints, and also the book, like, I think having a 17-inch printer is the best purchase I've ever made, you know, just having that, and being able to, you know, experiment. So
each student, by the way, has their own 17-inch printer, just as a
really
note. Yes, because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the group? Well, wow, people are thinking about the questions. Okay. Ian, you have one.
Greg, yeah. Well, Greg took the question that I was curious about was, like, the book, The Wall, and that navigation. But what's your favorite music? I'm just gonna go back down to that resort.
Favorite music? You know, actually, I was teaching, when I was teaching at Wesleyan, I had this one student who was just kind of, we became good friends, and he went to live off the grid, and he has a record label out, and they make really kind of experimental, weird stuff, like, you know, mix of country and everything. And so I kind of like I like hearing, yeah, what the kids make. But I've always been, you know, I was like a big Tupac fan when I grew up. I really loved rap music and Russian rap music. Russian rap was really big in Estonia. So
Okay, there was one question in the chat from Cameron, and it says, do you want to say anything about your preferences of books and finances? Would you manage your artistry, meaning true artistry, love your work, without being a teacher?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was, you know, I was in this, like, kind of, I was an assistant to this commercial photographer for a while, and I don't know, I just think I thought maybe to go more into that and push for that, but teaching to me seems like the most normal thing I can do for my brain, just for my sanity. And you know, I actually, you know, wasn't able to survive just with teaching. You know, I even in New York, at some point I had to go back to waitressing, and like, I think it's really difficult, but and you know, I just kind of stuck with it, with, you know, just teaching. And at some point I taught 5 classes a semester in 3 different schools, and it was nuts. I don't necessarily recommend it, but I, you know, now I'm okay. The last few years I'm okay, but yeah, I hope that answered the question. I forget what it was really. But
all right, did you have time to think about my question about?
Oh yeah, the final. You know, I was for maybe this is just a suggestion, just like in terms of self-care. And I, you know, I loved being in therapy, and talk therapy can be very helpful. But I learned when I was reading more about trauma and recovering from trauma, that sometimes you have to, you know, just like shake things out of you, or you have to move, and you have to dance, and you have to scream. And so I just also, I know that it's during these times we want to talk and reflect, and but I just hope everybody remembers to, like, you know, just even if you just dance by yourself or you move your body, like it kind of shakes you out of the, you know, maybe the anxiety and the trauma and you know, the challenging times. So I just want to remind everyone of that too.
Do you want to ask everyone to get up and do shake it out?
Yeah, 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 yeah. So, but thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Give Terttu a round of applause.
Yay. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Bye. Good to see you. Bye.